can you maybe answer Mark Retain's article to this point?
Can you use the mic?
The article is that we collect all this stuff and nobody ever uses it. So, there's a clear statement that we're not using what we're collecting, so why are we doing it?
First of all, I'm glad you're asking me and not Mark right now. But yeah, I think, well, certainly, I think, it's a partnership between industry, and I must say industry is usually quite generous, to give the drugs. Sometimes they even provide funding for good concepts. And I guess, you have someone who wants to work with your agents, has an idea. But no, I think it is very important to make sure that the samples are used and, the biomarker plans are well thought out and, they're not left as an afterthought, and I know we try to do that, but I think that's something that maybe could come out of this meeting, maybe, there should be a website or there should be a database where all these trials are put together. I've been looking for this in lung cancer. So again, going to our example of our lung protocol, we're looking for combinations in refractory disease. And I went to clinicaltrials.gov, and some of the trials are there, but not all of the early phase trials. Actually, one of the best places to get this is from the investment community. They have lists of all the drugs and the combos that are being done. But I think it would be a great resource, maybe if one of the foundations or groups put together, lists of what's being studied and what disease. I know it exists in different forms, but then also outcome, how many patients have been enrolled, what samples exist. And, because it's, as opposed to the studies that you would lead, Roger, from the company, then you have all those samples and you mine those samples. And we heard from Dan how they're mining it, for example, at Roche, from his trial yesterday.
I'm gonna shill for another company, so I hope that's forgivable. There's a new company in England, Beacon Horizons, that has developed a database that I used in part for putting together the information. That's trying to curate. They have PhD curators who are going to trials and immediately uploading the data as quickly as they can. If you go and look what they curated from ASCO, it's pretty impressive.
I should say your talk yesterday, how you pulled all that together to use whatever inkling. So
some of it was with the use of Beacon.
I see.
Matt?
Yeah, thanks, Rami. I want to go back to the question of redundancy and phase 3 studies. Obviously, the standard of care now is to do randomized studies, concurrently randomized patients. Are we willing to consider as an initiative to develop a database of comprehensive, let's say, information, and then work with statisticians about the merits of having what they call matching adjusted indirect comparisons for the future? So doing phase 3 studies that can go back and do matching comparisons to these databases. We can have statisticians from the FDA, the NCI, academia, industry sitting together and looking into the merits in terms of reducing redundancy. My other question is, would love to hear comments about health economics outcomes research and the importance of plugging these questions into studies, looking at cost consequences in addition to clinical benefits of certain sequences of new regimens and so on. Thank you.
So I can start, regarding your first question. So absolutely, we'd be very happy to participate in these discussions. Our statisticians, so we've clearly, recognize, these types of needs, as well as needs that are also brought forth by immunotherapeutics, which is this issue of non-proportional hazards. So FDA, is very happy to have these issues discussed and thinking about, ways to move, innovative methods forward for addressing, these issues. So, we're open to this type of discussion, and happy to support, this type of effort, moving forward.
Can I make a comment? Just as a late-stage clinical trialist, and there's nothing more reassuring to me than a properly done, robust, contemporaneous randomized trial with interpretable data. So I get nervous at the idea of moving away from such a gold standard, even though it's not perfect. On the other hand, it would be, if there is another way that maintains the robustness, that maintains the rigor, and maintains the confidence and the credibility in the trial, I would be all for it.
part of the Moonshot program, we advocated a common control, okay? And that was in part due to the renal cell issue that you had brought up previously, where there are many companies doing the same trial. And what we suggested to companies that were developing the same drug in the same indication, so to speak, is do a common control, okay, where they would take a standard and then compare themselves to that common control. We were aware, obviously, that people were not interested, or companies were not interested in comparing their drugs to another drug. So we said you could even, your primary comparisons could be from your drug to the common control and not between the experimental drugs. We put that out. We had many workshops on that. What was the interest in industry? Zero, okay? So I think that speaks legions here. I'd also like to address the issue that Roger brought out about synthetic arms, et cetera. Let's not move backwards, okay? Randomization is a very important tool, and I'm looking at Amy there because we had this discussion yesterday when she was visiting the FDA. What's the purpose of randomization? It's to take advantage of things that you don't know about, okay? And we may think we're so smart about these diseases, but we don't know about a lot of prognostic factors or other factors that may have an influence on overall survival or even time to progression, et cetera. That being said, we don't want to lose that tool, okay? And one of the things that we're very interested in is working with the big data companies to look at, can you build in randomization in a real world situation? And that could take advantage of the randomization issue. But to move backwards and just say, okay, Amy has collected 10 million patients with some form of cancer, okay, let's say anal canal cancer, okay, and we know everything there is in that arm in those 10 million patients, but I'm going to make a comparison. My treatment arm is only going to be 50 patients. Well, those 50 patients have the same prognostic characteristics as those 10 million patients that she has in her control arm. I doubt it, okay? And there are so many variations here. Even if you try to match presence or absence of liver metastases, you're going to have somebody that has a solitary liver metastases versus somebody that has potentially their entire liver is effaced by tumor, so to speak. So the concept of randomization, we really would like to attempt to preserve. That doesn't mean that you have to do it in the context of a clinical trial. It could be looked at in the context of a real-world data situation, and I think that is going to be a challenge for us to try to do, but that's where I see drug really development and the future of drug development occurring. Once you have randomization, okay, that obviates some of the sins of the world, so to speak, and washes away them, such as, I'm looking at Marty because there's a direct Catholic influence there, washes away the sins of the world, okay, as far as data quality, et cetera, because it just is randomized between the two arms. So you don't even really have to worry about, the nuances of data quality. It just makes the demonstration of superiority more difficult, but that's, the sponsor's problem, basically, so to speak. It really washes away these data quality issues, so to speak, because randomization is a powerful tool where unless there is a bias, and that's what we're more interested in, is a presence or absence of bias rather than perfection of data here, because that's the real realm here. But we really should not lose focus of the importance of randomization here. I think that would be really a step backward, because we really have no idea with a small patient population that could be treated and being compared to a much larger population if they're completely matched patients, so to speak, irrespective of what we think we know at that particular point of time. I hope that sheds some light. Okay.
I'm Louise Perkins from the Melanoma Research Alliance. We built out a patient-facing community online with a focus on clinical trials to try to differentiate that and to provide a way to educate patients about the importance of clinical trials and to hopefully support enrollment in those trials. And I guess I have a question for Una about, I always feel like that means we're supporting clinical trials on the coast and in the major academic centers elsewhere in the country, and that there are a lot of people in the rest of the country who are not, don't have the opportunity to have benefit of that. Or even, in the case of, let's say a particular drug's being studied at Yale, but, can't be, two similar things aren't likely going to be studied there because they may compete with each other. I wonder, is there a trial in a box concept that you think about that could be useful? Maybe Roger has a perspective on this as well, where it's a sidearm that would be easier to do, not an expanded access program. That's a little bit, almost a done deal, but something in between.
You bring up a really great point. And so I have been most of my career in an academic institution. So I took my knowledge of clinical trials to a community institution and pretty much took the same principles of what we needed to do, what did we need to offer to our patients. So approached it very, very operationally. What were our top 4 disease sites? What were our top 4 desires for clinical trials? Did we want adjuvant? Did we want metastatic? Did we want neoadjuvant? And then built the program in that direction. Now, most academic centers have what they call various different committees that make sure that they don't have competing studies. For me, I didn't have the bulk of that kind of regulatory environment. I just said, this is what we need to do, take our top 4 diseases. So I simplified what I knew had happened at academic centers. I would love to see a clinical trial in a box sort of way so that you could get a patient to a trial very quickly. Sometimes it's a matter of traveling. Sometimes it's a matter of what's inconvenient. And being in a community center and knowing what our population is from 67 to 87, those are patients that need transportation. They very often live on a fixed income. Clinical trials offer them a good benefit, and we bring in all of those finances related to all of that. So having at least a clinical trial in the disease sites in all of those settings was important for me. So I didn't need to have 50 trials open, but I have 50 open now because of just the advancement of what I needed to do. So we bring trials to patients that we know we have. I'm not opening up a GYN trial if I only have 50 GYN patients a year. But I have over 300 lung patients a year. I want a trial in that area. So operationalizing things and simplifying things in the community setting, I think, is the way to go. Because and pharma didn't want to come to us because we couldn't give them 20 patients to get onto their study very quickly to finish it. But then negotiating that I only had a 2-month lead time to get the study approved was my leeway to be able to talk to them and say, okay, I can get you a trial open in 2 months versus 6 months, but I can promise you only 4 patients. So those are the kinds of things that I would love to see as an example, helping other community centers get those trials open, choose the ones that are good for them, and then communicate, because we'd get data much faster that way.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So I think again, I can just sort of give you my personal sort of industry experience, and maybe Chris or Emmett could comment further. Phase 1 units, true phase 1 units are special areas, right? So they need to be, you're not going to get generalized availability of a drug that doesn't have a dose and doesn't have a schedule. So that part is clear. What happens next is perhaps a little bit more open to discussion, where, and I sort of floated this idea earlier, and it comes from Chris's comments around phase 1 and the use of phase 1 and signal finding, is in order, because the issue we face is patient heterogeneity. I mean, the signals, it's all about how variable humans are. And to Rick's point around randomization, that's what the randomization protects against, which is bias in heterogeneity. So signal finding, when dose and schedule is determined in expanded cohorts and community sites, actually makes sense to me, quality community sites, and that would then give you very early access in non-randomized trials. In my sort of drug development experience, I've always pushed teams to actually find community sites for randomized trials to make sure that we actually capture the population the drug is likely to be used for, and not to necessarily have an academic-heavy clinical trial footprint. Plus, the trials are often so big, there's no academic footprint that can actually support them. So I think that the availability of trials down into the sort of community hospitals, if they are quality sites, that they are able to generate, good quality data, that's possible. I'm not sure if you're thinking of another construct, because expanded access, as you say, is a different sort of animal.
Well, it's a different animal, but it also has its own constraints, because in that case, you're actually tending to give it to sites where there's already experience using the drug. So that doesn't necessarily serve the community unless the community already has experience with it. But my impression from a program I worked on that was a tissue collection program, the MMRF Compass study, was that we took that program as a registration study for newly diagnosed multiple myeloma patients, and we said, we're going to have to go to the community because we need all of these patients. And it turned out that in the community they would have one bad experience enrolling a patient and then they were done. So in fact, all of the patients did come from the academic centers anyway, because they knew that, well, sometimes you had a bad bone marrow aspirate and that was just the way of the world. So I think that the sensibility and the challenges of setting up a clinical study are not for the faint of heart. So maybe that was a little bit of my clinical trial in a box concept. Not a phase 1. It's too few patients, too much effort, don't know what's going to happen, but something that's a little more mature. I don't have an answer.
Right.
My sense is that the trials are getting out to the community. More than 90% of patients are treated there. The patients want trials, the community physicians want trials. Within our network, we have the downtown where we're doing the phase 1, the types of trials where you need the unit. And then for like the combos we heard from Emmett about, where you're combining chemotherapy with immunotherapy, where people already had experience with immunotherapy through their work with melanoma, through their refractory disease setting. Those trials accrued extremely well. Now the problem, of course, is for whatever reason, sometimes the trials are written to include a blood draw or some sort of processing of sample, and that can make it very hard at some sites that might not be able to do a spin down a tube of blood. They have to be within a certain amount of time from the center. But I think trials need to be written in a way that you realize they're going to be done at sites that are more remote. But trials like that can accrue quite well. And in fact, what we do at our center is we have a committee and we actually run it by the community docs first. Is this a trial that you can do? That, for example, if you want a trial where you're doing a PD-L1 biomarker or one of the gene signatures we heard about yesterday, that you would probably do at the main house. You've got to wait a few weeks. It's more complicated. But if there's a trial where you can just put people on right away, collect the sample, and then do the biomarker later, that could accrue very well. And I'd agree with Roger. That's the real-world experience. That's where you want to get the studies out to.
Great. Thank you very much.
Any other questions? All right, so actually I have a question about the something that we haven't touched on, but there was an effort to start collecting the patient-reported adverse events, and I think this is something that we've talked about it, but I'm not sure if it has been initiated or not, and I don't know if, Elad, do you know the patient-reported adverse events?
There are a few initiatives that are ongoing that were started through the Division of Cancer Control Population Sciences. They sort of created that tool, the Pro-CTCAE. Right. I think there are over 100 trials right now that are utilizing essentially the patient-reported outcomes version of CTCAE to try to see that we can create more tools that might be eventually potentially even utilized by the FDA or EMA or other health authorities. And some of them not, because this started some time ago, some of them have immunotherapy agents included on those clinical trials. So those efforts are certainly ongoing, and there are also electronic patient-reported outcome efforts that are now ongoing to sort of record things and put them immediately into the databases so that they can be reviewed along with the rest of the clinical trial. I think for some of these things, because they're new tools, they're relatively early days before they get validated.
Okay. Thank you.
If I could just make a comment, Remy, about patient-reported outcomes. Obviously it's a critical thing, but the tools that are available are so blunt. I hope no one takes offense to that, but it's very hard to show anything. Most of it because they're based on recall. They're not real-time, readouts of patient experience. So even though I have no real idea what wearables means, except that I understand the English, it does seem like, continuous monitoring of a patient's outcome may at some point become valuable to understand, what the patient experience looks like from that aspect.
great. Any of the panelists, anything else that they would like to add before we conclude the session? Or? All right, great. Then thank you, and thank you for being a great audience.